Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today. We're going to walk through a presentation that will be both a recap of a recent event that we were involved with, hosting a virtual conference, and reviewing a publication that hopefully you received this morning. That is a planning guide for virtual conferences. We'll be taking questions through the chat box. After the presentation, if you'd like to, we'll allow you to open up your microphones and let us know who you are, and anything that we can address, we'll be happy to. We are going to mute your microphones throughout, though, so that if you do need to pose a question, please use that chat box. So by way of introduction, my name is Michael Connett. I'm the Associate Deputy Executive Director of the Association for Career and Technical Education. And joining me today is my colleague, Lauren. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
That's great. All right, so let's get underway.
So we're really excited to be joining you today, particularly because of the fact that we're in just a different environment that we were in just a month ago, or even 2 months ago. And with everything that has been occurring with the COVID-19 crisis, we still want to feel connected with our members and feel connected with people who we work with on a daily basis, even though we can't be physically with them. So virtual conferencing is one way that we still can be connected with one another, especially as some of the conferences and events that we have for the future coming months probably won't be able to happen in person. So we just wanted to go through a list of why virtual conferencing overall. And these are the 5 things that we thought of. Virtual conferencing provides high quality professional development. It enhances in-person conferences. It expands access to audiences, creates networking, collaboration, and sharing opportunities, and offers interaction between practitioners and vendors. We also want to note that post-COVID-19, we still see benefits coming from having virtual conferences. We've had a lot of our members say that by having or by hosting virtual conferences, many of our participants and members have been able to join in on these virtual conferences when they wouldn't have been able to join in on the in-person events. So by having virtual conferences, we expand this to just more than the people who would normally come to these conferences. We're allowing it for more people to come in and to join and to gain this information and access to this network and community. So post-COVID, we see benefit and interest in virtual conferences overall. So in our heads, we thought of 3 different types of virtual conferences altogether. The first one is synchronous, which is live, where the presenters and the participants have real-time interaction, such as what's happening right now, but with a larger scale of people in the audience. The second is an asynchronous, where it's recorded. So presenters will pre-record their sessions, which will then give the participants access to those sessions. And this can happen anytime, anywhere. And ACTE actually just went through a mix of both of these, which is more of a hybrid, which is a mix of synchronous and asynchronous, which could also include a combination with an in-person event. And it can include technology-driven events as well. So for instance, say you have an in-person event, but you want to add a technological component to that, this is where the hybrid would come into play.
So building off what Lauren shared, we envision 3 levels, or we'll call those formats, for virtual conferences. And with each level, there are increasing expenses. So the most basic approach you would take would be to essentially collect materials that you would otherwise present at an in-person event. Those could be PowerPoints, handouts, other forms of presentation, perhaps some short videos. Those could be hosted on a website and arranged in such a way as to take on a package feel, thereby giving a sense of what we'd call a virtual conference. That would be, without a doubt, the most affordable first initial approach you could take. Stepping up to a bit more robust environment in an intermediate approach would be to bring to your website or a live meeting software program and bring to it with a mix of pre-recorded videos and allow for interaction between the attendees and the presenters through things such as a chat window, as we are today. Stepping up further, then you want to move into an advanced or a more comprehensive environment. This would typically be something, if you're looking at 500 or more attendees, you'd want to look for the assistance of an external provider. There are a number of companies that have surfaced and that have been around for a while that offer a full suite of options and services to help plan for, prepare, and implement a virtual conference. Just keep in mind that the more robust the environment that you select to deliver a virtual event from, the prices do increase. And I can tell you our experience in just early investigation to take on a large scale conference of several thousand attendees is going to run you well into the near six figures or oftentimes beyond six figures. So you want to be judicious in terms of what services you might use if you're just dipping your toe into virtual conferencing for the first time.
So we thought of a couple of different components for planning a virtual conference. These 5 components are what we used when we were planning our conference last month, but we feel these are important to any virtual conference or any conference in general. So the first one would be to develop a task list and a timeline. This is important because you want to then after this, think about assembling a planning team, and you want to assign roles and responsibilities and make sure that you have the capacity of a team and the capacity of a budget or a timeline in general, even just making sure that, hey, if we have a conference next month, we might need to push it back another month because we won't have enough time to get this together. So developing a task list and a timeline is key. And then I would recommend going into further assembling a planning team that you can assign those roles and responsibilities to. The next is to determine format and delivery mechanism. And this is all about thinking about your audience. So is your audience going to have Wi-Fi accessible? Are they going to have the platforms that you might want to use more? If it's a school-based, you might have to think about what restrictions there are, or government-based, you might have to think about that as well. The next is investigating between a turnkey or self-produced conference. If it's only 100 people, you might be able to do a self-produced conference. If it's more than that, you might have to look to a turnkey service or provider. And then the last thing that we had, the last very important component, is making sure that you communicate early and then communicate often, both to your team, your planning team, your participants, your presenters, your sponsors, practically anybody who's involved in this conference. You want to make sure you're always communicating.
Well, you're absolutely right, Lauren. I think all of us have the experience in working at our annual conferences, those in-person events, and know that communication is important. But in a virtual environment, it becomes a critical element that expands beyond what you've traditionally done. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But what are those traditional activities that you find in a virtual conference? Well, you'll still, of course, be bringing in sessions with presenters, and you'll be dealing with, a budget and how registration works and promotions, but it does differ in a virtual environment. For instance, if you're doing things as we are today in an online or digital environment, you need to keep in mind the typical attention span for the viewer. I think we've all experienced that in the last month or so, that you can over Zoomify yourself, and just being cognizant of that for your audience. Setting the expectations for virtual presentations with your presenters. They need to know precisely what type of environment that they will be able to function in. Lauren set up our work-based learning conference to allow for the presenters to interact through a chat window, but pre-record their sessions, sort of to focus on and allow for the engagement to happen around the content as opposed to after the content. So it wouldn't be totally replicating an in-person event. As far as building your budget, this is something that you're not unfamiliar with, but it is going to vary in a virtual event. For instance, speaker fees. We were able to renegotiate from an in-person to a virtual speaker fee with one of our keynote presenters at our recent conference. And in so doing, we did ask for some additional rights. For instance, the speaker typically who does a number of events annually might be concerned that by having a video of their presentation available, it could curtail additional speaking environments for them. We did enter into a contract negotiation that said that yes, we could use the video of that presentation, but for a limited term through a highly secure server. Security is an issue, and that does have budget ramifications as well on whether you have a customer relationship management or association database system that could interface with a live platform or with third-party vendor. And those are things that you'll want to investigate or make solutions available for. And then in a virtual event, certainly you would have some technology or those third-party software and service costs to consider. As far as registration goes, it's probably very similar to what you do in person, with a few exceptions. Most notably, if you're doing a virtual event, you might not have some of this, or you definitely won't have some of the expenses that you normally would in an in-person event. For instance, food and beverage, meeting room rental, those are things that you'll have an alleviation for, and that can bring down your overall cost to produce the event. So consequently, you'll want to consider pricing participation through those registration fees to be according to what your costs are and your expectations for any net revenue that you might generate. The other part of registration is tied to that security issue I mentioned before. Is your registration system able to connect with and provide authentication? Essentially, it's more than a password. It really is where the server that you're hosting is seeing the name or the email address of the individual and knowing that they were pre-registered and had paid for the event. And so how you conduct that digital registration service is extremely important. And then lastly, how do you promote a virtual event versus a normal? Well, obviously you've got the in-person events figured out, but you're going to need to message appropriately for the type of event that you're having. You need to be very clear with your audience on what to expect, not just the day and the time and where to show up, but you're going to need to let them know that the sessions are going to be perhaps shorter in length. You're going to need to communicate to them that this is an engaging opportunity, and come prepared with questions. And then lastly, you're going to need to explain to them the venue in which they'd be working within. So I saw someone raise the fact that third-party providers are very expensive, as I mentioned earlier, and that's absolutely true. Um, Again, depending upon the size and the scalability of your event, you may or may not want to pursue that investigation. I would just urge all of you to not be afraid to dip your toe in the water to explore what a virtual conference provider can offer. That way, if you choose or you're not able to partner with a third party, you'll better understand the services that they provide, as well as some of the costs that they would normally associate with that. I think that's really important for you to understand what your role would be if you did opt to self-produce your conference. However, just a quick run through some of the things that you see on this particular screen is just pointing out things you really need to know about that provider and see what their response and how they're going to address those critical needs for the event.
There we go, I'm muted. So when it comes down to planning through the conference itself, it's important to look at technology and tools that you can use during this planning time. Here at ACTE, when we did our conference last month, we saw that these 4 tools that are shown on the screen were very key and very good at keeping us organized and our team as well. So the first one that I would recommend is Google Suite, and that includes Google Docs. That's where you can even host your to-do list, so that way you can have multiple collaborators seeing it on real time. You can check off everything that as it's getting done. We'd recommend Google Forms for your presenters to upload and submit information such as their headshot, their bio, titles of presentations. We'd recommend Google Drive to host and store information. And then one that I forgot to leave off of here is Google Slides. We use Google Slides in our breakout rooms themselves. The next tool that we used was Slack, and Slack is an instant messaging system that you can use internally with your team. So what that means is during the event, if you have questions and comments, you can think of it almost as like you're sending a text, but you're sending it through your computer through this software. You can just receive it, and you can even have group messages too. So that was very beneficial for us. The next thing is a conference call. So we use free conference calling just for the aspect of it's free, it was accessible to everybody. But with this, you can chat with the team during live events or live during the event setup. So for instance, when we promoted our work-based learning on that Wednesday morning, our whole team was on this conference call line. And so when we had issues arise, we could say, hey, so-and-so, can you handle this? And I'll handle that. And it was just so nice to be able to be on that line together, because it was almost like we were in the same room together. And the last feature that we really used and that worked well was Doodle Poll. And I'm sure that some of you probably are very familiar with this, but the idea with Doodle Poll is that if you need to have a meeting, you can send out a Doodle Poll with different times, and then everybody can vote on which time works the best. And we use that for room hosts, we use that for presenters, and we use that for our internal team as well. So these are just 4 tools that we saw were important and beneficial to planning our virtual conference, and we feel that they might be beneficial towards you too. The other thing to keep in mind is the team preparation and issues. So throughout our conference last month, we kept saying, plan for the worst, strive for the best. And when we think about that, it comes down to, we want the best to happen, but sometimes things happen, like Wi-Fi goes out or a server crashes, or who knows what could happen. So as we're thinking about those things, plan for the worst, strive for the best, you want to think about everything that could possibly go wrong and set up a plan B just in case that happens. So for instance, we definitely made sure that we had a test day where we could both plan and have all of our participants, all of our presenters, all of our team come to the virtual page, and that way they could go to that virtual realm that we were in. We use Zoom, and test everything out. So we could share the tools, we could share the screens, we could share it all. But then in addition to that, we set up a tech support team. So that way, in case something did go wrong, one of the worst case scenarios, somebody was there to be there and stop it. So we had a person working on the website. We had a person that would work with registration. We had a person who would work with Zoom complications. And we even had somebody who served as like our front desk too throughout the day. So that way any calls or any emails went to that person rather than coming to somebody like me who was in charge of Zoom, or our program coordinator who was in charge of the whole entire conference. We also had training even just for the room hosts, just making sure that everybody knew what they were doing and how they were supposed to be doing it. And although there were some issues still, we felt like those preparation times were beneficial and helped us not have more problems than we already had. So it goes into next with the program components. So this is thinking more towards schedule and more towards what do we need in a virtual conference? What makes it successful? So the first thing that came to our minds when we did this was having a session, a pre-session before the conference even came about, probably like a week or a couple days before, where we could bring in everybody just to have virtual instruction. So we had a test day, as I mentioned in the last slide. And during that test day, we had all of our participants log in through their alphabet, through their last name, so A through Z, and we had designated times. So for instance, like A to F might have logged in from the morning portion, and then so on and so forth. And during that time, we had somebody on our virtual realm, which was Zoom, and just talk to them. Hey, congratulations, you made it into the virtual room well. Here's some of the tools you can use. Did you have any troubles? So by having that session for virtual instruction, it allowed for less chaos on the day of the actual event. Another way that you could do this is to have a first timer or reception session about 30 minutes before a general session. So for instance, if your general session starts at 11 o'clock in the morning, you might want to consider having a session at 10:30 where you have all the first timers come in. And then during that 10:30 period till 10:55 or whatever, you just go over things again, like such as the virtual instruction. Hey, we're using Zoom. These are some tools on Zoom. Or hey, we're using this, and this is how this is going to look. This is how you mute your microphone. This is how you use the chat. Make sure to mute your microphone. Little things like that. In the general sessions, we would recommend doing the same things that you might want to do when you have an in-person conference, just to make it feel homey. So we recommend having a host or an MC throughout the event, doing the Pledge of Allegiance. You can share a YouTube video of the national anthem playing, little things like that. You can do VIP and sponsor introductions the same way by having a PowerPoint going with the pictures and the slides of people's names. And then just having interaction as well, through polling, through whiteboard activities, through breakout rooms, through just asking questions and just starting conversation too. One way we also did this was having like waiting room music, just to make it feel more like you're actually at a conference. And then lastly, going into concurrent sessions. So these are the breakout rooms, right, from outside of your general session. We'd recommend no more than 30 minutes of this time, just because, sitting behind a screen all day, it's a lot. And then we also recommend having a room host or a moderator for the chat so they can just facilitate the question and answer period. And in these breakout rooms, you can use the same interactions that you would have in the general sessions, just on a smaller scale. So you can use the whiteboard, or you can use, in Zoom, it's called breakout rooms. You could use polling, you can ask questions, you can have people annotate their screen. And then we also just recommend that you build in time in your schedule for environmental breaks. So that way things aren't back to back to back. And so that way participants can have some break time, some actual break time away from the computer themselves. So these are the program components we think are important for a successful virtual conference.
And Lauren, I just emphasize that you really are the guru behind that music before the sessions. I know in the chat box for the general sessions, there were quite a few comments about how nice it was to have that in the waiting period before the program began. So that's just a little tip to let you know. So let's talk a little bit about other features you'd see at a normal or an in-person event that you'll want to consider for your virtual event. And that is, of course, attracting and retaining and servicing sponsors and exhibitors. The key here is that in a virtual environment, you need to be sure to carve out specific activities for your attendees to engage with those parties. And so just a couple tips here. Consider having some form of a virtual exhibit hall. We'll share with you what we were doing, but they take on a lot of different shapes and sizes. You could get very elaborate or have something very simple. Again, we'll take a look at that in just a moment. One of the key things that I would say that you'll want to do is to visit with your sponsors and exhibitors to get their input, hear their ideas on what they'd like to see have happen, what they want to have come out of their investment of time and money in your virtual event. A lot of the traditional things still apply. You can do their logo placement. You can ask them to speak in front of a general session if they're one of your top sponsors. But perhaps you could go further and offer opportunities to have a specific room sponsor and or host, and sponsor or exhibitor, and ask them to produce maybe a 60 to 90-second video that you could play in sequence prior to the actual presentation. You can also get their investment in things such as that you normally do at in-person events, like getting their contributions for drawings, or if you wanted to get elaborate and send out a conference attendee packet by the mail in advance, and you might want to include some novelty or promotional items from those exhibitors and sponsors. You're really going to want to think outside the box and to consider those strategies where you're looking at ways to meet the needs of those exhibitors and helping them explain how their solutions address the needs of presenters. Now, I know we all try to do this in our in-person events, but I think the opportunity to maybe put on a new hat and look at some digital ways of doing that. And so we've been exploring, and we know a few of our state associations are looking at retargeted advertising options. If you're not familiar with that, again, in the planning guide, we've got some resources there for you to check out just to help you learn a little bit more about it. As I said, you want to make certain that you carve out space for attendees to be able to interact with those exhibitors and give them a reason to be in there. So how do you incentivize those attendees to go in? You know, traditional things can be replicated in a digital environment, such as creating, some prize drawings or putting a check-in. You might want to consider using some social media tools like how many tweets are generated by an individual, and then whoever is the maximum tweeter from visiting the exhibit hall could be selected for a specific prize. Really, the key though is to get the give the attendees a chance to interact with those exhibitors. And we were fortunate in that we used one tool that I think offers a lot of promise, that allows for real-time discussion boarding with the attendees. So we'll show you a glimpse of that in just a second. Lauren said it best. That's communicate early and communicate often. Again, I think we do a really great job as associations in communicating about our in-person events, but it is different in a virtual environment, and I can't stress that enough. Lauren talked about that communications plan as the starting point, and you may not know at the outset all of the things that you're going to need to communicate about. So build and allow for some opportunistic communications, not just to increase the number of emails that you send out, but think about how you want your planning committee to have ownership of specific activities here. Think through the information that your presenters are going to need and how often and what type of support that they might benefit from. Certainly your room hosts are critical links that they need to not only be trained, but you need to give them an opportunity to do a dry run through or two or three. And then, we talked about the tech support team, but otherwise keep your board involved, because as you can imagine, it's a lot of work to put on an in-person conference, and it's a lot of work if you've not put on a virtual conference for the first time. I will tell you, we learned a lot, and hopefully you'll see that in that guide that we shared. Your conference promotions, as I alluded to earlier, are going to need to take on a slightly different look and feel. And so that last bullet is consider using video. You might already do some of that, but you might want to rethink and strategize about the use of video to deliver things such as how you navigate the program agenda. You might want to do a short video from your conference host to talk about the process to interact during the sessions. Or you might want to get a specific video message from one of your keynote presenters to encourage and excite your attendees for in advance of their session. But by using video in some less than traditional ways, in innovative ways, you're going to signal that the virtual event that you're putting on is going to be more than just a simple one-way direction of content that people could perhaps get at any time, but through your conference is the key. So let me just wrap up the first part of our presentation by talking about the $10,000 or $100,000 question, and that is, how do you budget for this? So, keep in mind that you're going to follow the same process of building a budget, and that budget needs to include not only your fixed expenses, but some unknowns that you're going to encounter while planning, things such as the technology. You also want to keep in mind that that budget is going to need to reflect what your expectations are if you use your conference as a revenue generating opportunity. We did not go into our work-based learning conference event thinking it'd be a one-for-one pricing. A couple factors there included we collapsed a 2-day event down to 1 day. We had the alleviating effect of not having food and beverage or AV or facility costs. And quite frankly, we wanted to make it accessible to have as many people as possible come to the conference. You also want to think about what you do after your conference. Certainly, you want to give those who registered, paid, and attended, or if they weren't able to attend after they registered the day of the event, a chance to come back and access all of the content. That's one of the real exciting and I think bonus features for attendees. For our conference, we had 5 concurrent session slots and 3 general sessions. So the most any attendee, if they were trying to capture the fullest content, in other words, attend the entire length of a concurrent session, the most they would have been able to have obtained would have been 8 sessions on the day of the conference. Whereas having a after conference site, we are hosting all 53 sessions that were delivered that day, giving the attendees a chance to come back after the fact at their convenience, anytime, anywhere learning, and be able to benefit from the expertise that you're providing. The other thing you can do with that after conference is to open it up to those who might not have heard or planned to participate in the original event. This is also a revenue generating opportunity, and we'll talk more about that in a moment when we take a look at CTE Learn. So we are going to take questions in a few minutes. I see a few have popped up here that we'll want to come back and address. But let's take a look first at the environment we use for the Work-Based Learning Conference. And so Lauren, if you wouldn't mind taking us on a quick walkthrough. You're muted, Lauren.
Okay, I'm having some issues. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I was having some issues there. So the first thing that we wanted to show you is the landing page that we used for our virtual work-based learning conference last month. So this was through our internal website, and this is what our landing page looked like. So you would see, here's our title, here's some of our exhibitors, our sponsors. If you scroll on down, you'd see our guest speakers. And if you scroll down further, you'd be able to see our breakout sessions. And the cool thing with this page is that we wanted to make sure that there were different breakout sessions. So we actually had 50 altogether. So there was quite an abundance to pick from. And because there was quite an abundance on this landing page, you could go and click on the title and see the description. And that helped a lot of our participants be able to get to see what session in particular they wanted to go to. So out of all 5 concurrent sessions, there were 10 altogether in each of them, creating 50. The other thing that we would note with this is that we had our lunch break time, we had our general session as well, some information there about the speakers. But on the top of our page, let me just move my box here, you could go up here to the top and look a little bit more into the about section, which just has, a little bit more about the team from Iowa, a little bit more about our team, the schedule layout. So if you needed to go and get like a print copy, you could get the schedule there. And then I know there was a couple questions in the chat about the virtual exhibit hall, and this is what our virtual exhibit hall looked like. So it took you to this page, and here we had all of our exhibitors listed. And if you went and clicked on one, so we'll click on John Deere Van Wall really quick, it took us to this page that just shared a little bit about the exhibitor itself. So we got to see an About Us section, got to see some resources, and then the contact information over here. But then also we had used this built-in feature that we paid for called Chat Roll, which allowed us to go in and have a conversation with an exhibitor who actually committed to being there that day virtually through this chat. And so we saw people come in. Of course, right now you can't see it because we're not signed in quite yet, but there was chats going on during the day of the conference from this exhibit page. And we did this for all of our exhibitors throughout the day itself as well, which was very beneficial because then they still at least got a piece of the day. One thing that we forgot to mention that these exhibitors all gave us a pre-recorded video that we played before each concurrent session, which allowed them to also be part of the day. So it was kind of like a commercial per se that played for, I think it was a minute or two before each of the concurrent sessions. But I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who's going to share a little bit about CT Learn and what that looks like. And Michael, I'll give you access to control this if you'd like.
Great, thank you. One other thing I'd mentioned about the National Conference site you just saw was that in each one of the tracks or session times that Lauren showed you, is that it was only available to click into that specific concurrent room during the time of that slot. So what you're not seeing today that participants did at 9:30, they were going to see the room numbers were all linked into that space. That's how they were navigating in and out. Just to give you that little bit of background. The page also had there at the top, Lauren, I don't know if you could scroll back up. At the very top, we gave access to the full program, the exhibit hall, again, the schedule, but then also we did some information about the conference under About. And then halfway down the page, you could see we had the tech support access and activity, and that linked directly to a member services person who is standing by and on that conference bridge that Lauren mentioned earlier. So thanks for showing that, Lauren. Let's take a spin over to CTE Learn. Hey, and could you go back to the home page for CTE Learn, Lauren, if you don't mind?
Yep.
So if you've not participated, in CT Learn as a unified state yet, then I just wanted to introduce the concept of our online learning network. We have a very robust set of credit courses, free resources, and we also partner with about 18 states now on our state portals, and every state has a customized branded site. But there on the top navigation bar, you'll see virtual conferences. Obviously, our first one under our belt was the Work-Based Learning Conference. Again, you could see the environment here, very, very inviting. And then Lauren's already logged in, take you into the environment. Fairly simple recreation of what we did on the day of the conference. Our general sessions are there. Our breakout sessions are numbered accordingly. And then on the left side of the screen, there are resources that the presenters made available for each of the sessions. So you can see all the different things there on the left side. And then as Lauren pointed out, the additional resources that are available for all attendees. Hey, Lauren, can we go into breakout session 1?
Any of them?
Yeah, any of them are fine. Just to give everyone a sense of what's in here. So if you'll recall, we mentioned earlier that we did a hybrid conference. So we had a live room host who was on screen and welcoming the attendees and walking through the protocol and logistics, some little tips and techniques. We shared a short vendor or exhibitor video, and then we ran the 25 to 28 minute long video of the core presentation. So if you scroll down here, you'll actually get to see the session description, and then below that, who the presenters are, and then actually access the presentation for each one of these sessions. We don't need to show that, just give you the idea of how the navigation works here. And then you could scroll through this particular session block by using the arrow that you saw at the bottom. So we thought it was really important for you to get to see this environment today. Something we didn't talk at great length about today is the security and authentication. I just want to be fully upfront that there's been a lot of conversation about offering a secure environment, and the vendor that we went with, Zoom, has been a recipient of some of those concerns. And the good news is that we worked in very close consultation with them, understanding what they were offering and what they were building to respond to that concern, and felt as if we got a really good partnership with them. We took it to the next level, and we put essentially a 2-step authentication process in place. So this required that 100% of anyone who was going into the conference and or who's going into CTE Learn be in our membership database. And then those individuals needed to have a special authentication key set up to access the conference. So if you have registered, your account information was being transferred into the page that was essentially hosting the conference. We added that second step then of putting a password in front of the specific conference page to further limit the access to just those who were registered. The same is true now for the CTE Learn after conference site. So I know we covered a lot of information. We're going to just take one final look at this next page. If you've not seen the guide that we put together, if you haven't gotten a copy, we'll let you know how to do that here on the next slide. But we see this as a particularly important tool right now for two purposes. One, clearly, if you're just now getting a footing and understanding what virtual conferencing would look like, this would give you sort of a broad brushstroke on what elements and what activities need to go into planning your conference, as we've tried to do today. The second purpose would be if you are planning on producing your own event, it does have specific resources, but it also provides you an opportunity if you're looking to have an outsourced solution, a third-party provider deliver a virtual event for you, activities and information that you will need to understand and be involved in managing. I just want to emphasize that point because there's a lot of discussion about going to a third-party vendor that they'll do it all. And they may, and it may be very pricey, but at a certain point, you're still going to need to tell that vendor what your expectations are, and you'll need to manage those deliverables from the vendor. Otherwise, you're basically going to get a cookie cutter event. So this guide was produced, intended to try to give you enough information so that you'd be successful. So that's us. More pictures, but we'd be happy to take questions now. Lauren, I know you're a master at scanning through the chat area and putting questions forward, or if you'd like to unlock the microphones now, Lauren, and let people open up their microphones as they ask a question.
Thank you. You're welcome, sir.
Yep, I muted back everybody because it seemed like there's a lot of stuff going on. But if you have a question, feel free to unmute. There was a question in the chat box, Michael. There were a couple I saw. The first one is, how much did it cost ACTE to produce our past event last month?
Mute.
Oh, I got him unmute. Got him.
And that's my story. I'm sticking with it.
No, come on, Michael.
Our costs were primarily focused on the technology. However, we also had some speaker fees that we covered, as well as when we were planning the in-person event, we had a contractor who was working with us on that event. So it's difficult to extract out some of the costs that were incurred simply by our planning for the in-person event from the total budget. I can tell you that our finance person is working on that right now, so I can come up with an exact cost, but I'm just going to tell you that it is ballpark of $10,000.
There's another question in the chat that said, did you Zoom and run the event yourself? So we did. I became a Zoom expert about 45 days ago when this all happened. But yeah, no, we use Zoom. We also looked at other opportunities too, but we thought, with the size that we had, and somebody asked how many participants we had, and Debbie answered it. So we had about 400 to 500 people. And the breakout rooms were easy to manage. So we did a lot of training with our internal staff, or I should say Michael and I did with our internal staff on Zoom. And then they were able to go forward and use Zoom on their own, such as the room hosts and the breakout sessions. I'm reading these chat questions.
Hey, and Lauren, go ahead and find another one, but I would add that the conference really was successful because we had a mix. We did have staff. We know many of our state associations are operations of one, so we're fortunate in that regard, but we also leaned heavily on volunteers to serve as those room hosts and in other capacities, be it tech support or in planning. And so I want to give you some sense of optimism that it's not an insurmountable task to take on. But having said that, I will tell you, and by virtue of us doing this session today, it is the first time out a steep learning curve, as Lauren just suggested. I feel very, very fortunate that we had someone like Lauren, our program coordinator for our work-based learning, Kelly Deemer. They really shouldered an enormous load that otherwise they would not have had to in a traditional environment. So really fortunate to have had that in place.
Yep. So there's a question that said, asking me, did I call? Oh, oops, the question went back. The question was, did I just call Zoom and tell them what I needed? So yeah, so what I did is I went on Zoom's website, and because of everything with COVID-19, there was a large need for virtual, not just conferencing, but virtual ways to communicate with other people. So I just went through and read. And when Michael and Kelly were trying to figure out what would work best, I just said, Zoom has the capacity. And they also have different, and not saying Zoom is the end all be all, there's Skype. We actually had a technical difficulty with one of our main speakers who worked at the Department of Education. Some entities don't allow Zoom. So we actually had to use Skype through Zoom. So there's other ways to look at it. Skype, there's Zoom, there's GoToMeeting, WebEx as well. Zoom worked for this conference, but I think if it became a bigger size conference, we might have had to go to a different platform. But I ended up just going and talking with Zoom, we ended up getting a membership through Zoom. So that's how that worked.
Hey, I saw a note here from Tom from Oregon. Great you're with us today. I don't want to sound boisterous, but that's one of the things that we're most proud of. We put together a very high quality event, and it showed based on the response. I also want to be upfront and let you know that we ran into a few technical issues right at the outset of the event. Our hosting provider had at the very moment that we were about to go live, they were undergoing a denial of service attack. So while we had upwards of 500 people all hitting the site at one time, they had tens of thousands of hits trying to access the site. The good news is they didn't get in. The bad news is it gave us a little momentary pause, but we had a backup plan in place where we were immediately able to get direct links out to each of the meeting rooms along with the program schedule so that the attendees would still be able to participate at that first event. Had that cleared up by the time we went into their second session, that made a difference. So back to the feedback that we got. We did a closing general session, and I will tell you, unlike a lot of in-person events, when numbers start to dwindle, they did not. We kept about 75 to 80% of the attendees at the last session that we had at the first general session. And before the final closing session concluded, we must have had 150, 200 comments in the chat box, many of them very specific, talking about a session they had attended or the overall experience. And then following the event, we've had a number of congratulations and inquiries in. And so that's why we're doing this event today, is because we feel as if we've learned something that hopefully it can help all of you, but also the last thing I wanted to say about CTE Learn is that those of us who are a part of the CTE Learn network are fortunate that we're receiving free hosting as an offer for the asynchronous or the after conference. And so we've had a number of people, not only who had registered and attended the conference, come into the virtual after conference site, but we've begun having a number of new registrations, hence producing some new revenue from the conference through the after site.
Michael, there's a couple of questions on there about speaker recording and how the contracts work with that. I know we talked about that earlier, but I think some folks joined later if you wanted to touch base about that.
Yeah, sure. So most of you know Josh Davies from the Center for Work Ethic Development. He is what we call on the circuit quite a bit, and he will normally have a set day rate that he'll charge that includes his travel costs. So when we were making the decision to go virtual, I reached out to Josh and asked if he could renegotiate his agreement, reflective of the fact that he wouldn't have to travel, wouldn't be giving up a whole day. It was something that he was interested in exploring, having never done a virtual conference. And so we were able to negotiate his conference down by 2/3. We just rewrote the agreement to explain how we were going to use the program. This is where we set an expiration on the use of the pre-recorded video the recording of his live video presentation. And I think he felt really good about this. So Lauren was mentioned, one of our other keynote speakers. We had some technical issues, and Lauren and she and I put our heads together and came up with a workaround solution. And that was reflective of the agreement that we had with her as well.
I'm just reading. I'm trying to answer all the Zoom questions on the chat, but just in case you didn't read the chat, ACTE had a pro package. We went to a business package, which included 10 hosts. And just to answer that other question that was asked, so we had 10 room hosts, 10 breakout rooms, and then we used one of our personal rooms for the main general session. And the general session just was on during those times that we needed them to be on. But that was like our main room in a sense. And so there's a lot of, I answered this in the chat, but I learned most of my stuff from Zoom from YouTube videos, to be quite honest. But there are trainings that you can get done through Zoom, but I think they just cost a little bit extra. But there are ways to learn about Zoom and all the other programs too. There was a question on here about conference payment.
Lauren, can I jump in verbally? This is
Yep.
Tim. Question, you mentioned Zoom capacity 500. If you were going to go bigger, you were talking about maybe needing a different platform. Do you happen to know what that break point is, the number? Is it 500, 800, 1,000? What's the, I was on a training like this a few days ago with a international nonprofit, and they did a thing with, and I think he was talking about using Zoom. They had 4,000 people.
Yeah, Tim, you can go, unlimited. I mean, the largest one I've heard was 19,000 with Zoom, and similar size with WebEx. I mean, it boils down to the type of event that you want to have and host. The reason why Lauren mentioned earlier about 500 as a break point in terms of going to a third party is just the amount of human or personnel resource that you will need as you move into a much larger conference. Lauren, we actually upgraded our account from 300 to 500, 500 to 1,000, if you'll remember. And you're able to do that on a month-by-month basis. So basically, you're paying for a one-time charge to expand the number of seats or rooms that you would have at any type of virtual conference.
Super, thanks.
Hey, Lauren, I also just wanted to mention a few people have asked about getting a copy of the planning guide and the presentation. So I know, Lauren, you're going to work to get this presentation hosted on the ACTE online website. If you want a copy of the planning guide, you see Lauren and my email there. Just drop us a note. We're happy to send that out to you. Again, we hope that it's been helpful and that there's been some value in spending some time today talking about our experience. So any other questions? Or Lauren, are there more chat questions?
I think that was it. But if you have specific, and I put this in the chat box, but if you have specific questions about Zoom or what we did, just feel free to email us and we'll be sure to answer it. This was our first go around, but we felt like it was pretty successful for the first time.
Yep, and we're jumping back into the fire on May 21st. Our colleague Jamie Alston, I think, is here with us. She's taking lessons learned, having been a participant in the first planning team, and will be hosting the ACTE Region 4 conference on May 21st. So for anyone who's interested in getting some outstanding leadership professional development, that event's coming up, and get a chance to see us in action again.
I think that's it, Michael, for today.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us again, and please let us know if there's anything we can do to help. I did, you know what, I saw one other question about does ACTE plan to assist states with their conferences, and I would encourage you to feel free to reach out to us. We're exploring that option right now.
All right, everybody. Well, stay safe and healthy, and we look forward to maybe virtually seeing you or seeing you in person soon.
Bye now.
Thanks, guys.